The name of the game is really following, in many cases, the customer. One question we got recently from a bank, which was really insightful, I think, though, is, hey, look, in my community, my customers aren't pushing me, though. And so then what? At what point do I, the bank, need to say, all right, nobody's asking me for this, but gosh, it seems like everybody else is doing it, or maybe it is the right idea. And that's probably a challenge that many community banks especially deal with, where they have to, in some ways, prod their customers to explore more digital options.
It's that classic, if I had asked my customers what they wanted, they would have asked for a faster horse. And you go, that's not always the right answer, right? You need to observe all the things that are happening there. And people may not define banking in the exact same terms as a bank might.
Welcome to the Operate Podcast, where we give you a behind-the-scenes look at company building from the perspective of the builders themselves. This is how we operate.
Welcome to the Operate Podcast. I'm Kerry Ransom. Today's episode is sponsored by BankTech Ventures, the first strategic investment fund designed by the community banking industry for community bank innovation and investment. BankTech identifies leading products and technologies for banks and works with the founders and management teams to maximize the impact for the banks and their businesses. If you're a bank looking to innovate and invest in your future, or a founder who wants to work with banks, reach out to BankTech Ventures at banktechventures.com. My guest today is Brooke Ybarra, SVP of Innovation and Strategy at the American Bankers Association. She took a really unique path, at least from my perspective, to that role, starting her career with the CIA, and then she spent some time in strategy consulting. And then she even had a really critical role during the pandemic in a big corporation, many of you would recognize. And then she joined the ABA. So we'll definitely talk about that journey today. But Brooke has really brought an energy and creativity to the ABA. I've felt it since the moment we met. And she really is big on introducing more innovative thinking and action as well amongst the member banks of ABA. And I have to say, it's been great to see. Brooke, I'm so excited to finally put a conversation between us in recording. Thanks for joining me.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Kerry. I appreciate that kind introduction. And it's been really great to get to know you and your work over the last couple of years as well.
It's been fun, but let's jump into a topic. I know we've covered some ground, but it's this sort of the conflict that I often find in banking and technology, banking and transformation, where you and I both sit. And for a long time, the two didn't really coexist. You had banks doing their thing, you had disruption and innovation happening largely outside. It's now really come together and it's changing quickly. So as you think about your day-to-day job, we're at the early part of a new year, how do you think about the current states of innovation and transformation in banking?
Yes, a good starting question. There's certainly a lot going on, no shortage of things. How you set up the question definitely resonates. And I think at one time, right, there was this sense of really significant competition in many ways, and a bank and a fintech, like never the two shall meet. Yep. And now I think just in the 3.5 years I've been at ABA, even in that short time, there's been this transition where we're talking much more about partnership and how we work together and leveraging different solutions and the strengths of what each party brings to a relationship. But look, at the end of the day, I think the current state of innovation and transformation in banking is good. It's on the upswing. I think there's a lot to be proud of as an industry of what's been accomplished over the last many years, but over the last short period too. Is there still work to be done? Absolutely. And I'm sure we'll talk about that. But what I've got to see at the ABA is all banks' efforts to better meet their customers' expectations. And I think it's really important to remember that's kind of where it all begins. The reason to innovate is to do a better job in
That's right.
service of your customers, whether it's offering products that better meet their needs, that are more personalized to them, that help get more or underbanked individuals into the banking ecosystem, improving on different pain points. That's the goal. That's why innovation is so important. And can banks do it in a silo all on their own? No, probably not. And
Right.
that's where it's really great to see such a range of third-party solutions and consultants and venture funds and different stakeholders in this ecosystem, trade associations that are developing resources and working toward that common goal.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to characterize it. And in many respects, at least the way I think about it, coming newly into this at about the same time you did, banks just have to have a different group of partners and voices than they probably historically had, where for a long time you could stay within your silo where they're sourcing new ideas, new information, new solutions has to just come from a somewhat different place, or at least a bigger set of places than maybe it historically did.
Yeah. Even that concept, I think you see even within a bank, right?
That's
Where
right.
there's a greater sense of cross-functional teams
Mhm.
and bringing compliance and legal into product demo discussions really early in some of these conversations. Just, yeah, this sense that it takes a village. I don't know, it's very cliche, some of these terms, but it's the reality, actually.
That's right. Well, that leads really to my next question, which is, as you think about all the needs, it's a lot of change that I see likely to need to occur in banks. And so there are all these new and different needs that in many cases they have. So as you think about your role, like, where do you feel like you're having the biggest impact in
Yeah.
your role with them?
I would say, I hope I am having an
Oh,
impact and
for
I'm
sure you are.
certainly having an
I've seen it.
impact. It's hard though, and I'm sure your listeners know 4,700 banks in the United States. It is a really big ecosystem of
Mhm.
individual institutions, much more diverse than I think I fully understood before I joined the ABA. And there's not a one size fits all
That's right.
approach for each of them. And as you think about what innovation is right for one bank versus another bank, it may not be the same answer. And when we think about how can we be most impactful at the ABA on this set of issues, it's helping the bank think about what's right for them. And
Mhm.
in a lot of cases, there may be an element of demystifying some of the techie buzzwords and the shiny new objects and the things that maybe on the surface seem like, oh gosh, we should be doing this. And some of it is saying, okay, let's talk about what that is.
Mhm.
And does that sound like something that your customers need today, in 3 years, in 5 years? There's sometimes, I think some of the greatest impact we can have is helping frame what's going to be what's in fitting with your strategy, what's in fitting with your customer base today, and how you see it evolving over the next 3, 5, 10 years. And then, so what technology, what innovation is necessary for those needs? Because it might not be setting up a branch in the metaverse.
Mhm.
Maybe it will. For some banks, that might be absolutely the most important thing
Yep.
they should be working on. But for 4,700 banks, probably
Probably
not.
not. That's right.
But there's a lot out there. And I think it's really helpful for many banks to feel like they have a partner just to think about, I don't want to fear of missing out. I don't want to miss out on something I need to be focusing on. But there is a sense of level setting. What are the right things? How do we make those decisions?
Yes. And the thing I pick up using the word what a lot and even how. The good thing is, I think for both of us, we've seen the shift from why, meaning like, why do I need to do this, to now it's more action of, yeah, what to do and how. And that we've seen that change dramatically in the last 3 years. And to your point, I find that we have very different cadences with different banks, and it's not size based, or it's more strategy based, or what is their appetite for
Yeah,
change or doing things earlier. And we have ones that they want to compare notes very regularly and hear the latest and greatest, and we have others that are much more methodical and they want to meet once a quarter or once a
right.
year even to plan out how they're doing things. And so that pace of how they're thinking about executing their strategy and dealing with change is I see being very different. And not to say that there's only one way to do it, to your point, but I
Yeah.
feel like banks that maybe felt much more similar 5, 10 years ago are not going to feel nearly as similar 5 or 10 years from now.
Yeah, it's really interesting. A question we get a lot from members is they think about what are the biggest trends in bank innovation? Well, that's a pretty hard question to
It
answer
is.
actually, because it's very broad. And a variation is what are the trends in community banking? So then we can narrow maybe a little bit by
Mhm.
asset size. But even that, there's what are you focused on? Does your bank do mortgages, or are you only in kind of retail or commercial, or where's your focus? It just isn't a common answer for everyone. But across the board, we hear banks want to hear what other banks are doing. They want to hear those stories, right? What are my peers doing? And maybe it's going to be right for me, or maybe it's not, but you just want to know and feel like, I think it gives a sense of comfort, right?
That's right.
That you're on the right path or not.
That's right. Yeah, it takes a pretty bold leader in any industry, banking or otherwise, to stand alone and say, we're going to go craft a completely unique strategy different from any other bank like us. So there is somewhat of a comfort in show me somebody else who's done this and done it
Right.
successfully
And at the
first.
end of the day, what is banking? Deposits, lending, and payments. And
That's
so
right.
there's, of course, many variations on that, but at its core, it's those three buckets of value.
That's right. One of the questions that I ask myself a lot is just this: can they keep up? Can they catch up? Because
Yes.
change is happening. And I know you also, you're curious in the world like I am, and you're paying attention to what non-banks and fintechs and others are doing. It's a threat to banking, maybe partner opportunities, but also it is typically moving a little bit faster and showing what the future might look like. As I think about that catch up, keep up, what do you think they can? Like, will customers give them the benefit of the doubt if you look ahead? And they are still so far behind.
So for me, it's a resounding yes. I really genuinely believe that and for a couple reasons. One, trust. You'll hear the
Mhm.
ABA talk a lot about trust, but I think you hear customers talk a lot about
For
trust.
sure.
And that's the banking industry is built on that trust. And there's a lot of reasons for it. And the regulatory environment is part of it. The deposit insurance framework is part of it. There are various elements to that, but that at its core has been important historically, and I think will continue to be important into the future. And then I think banks are evolving. I think customers see that. They're incorporating new technology where it makes sense for them and for their customers, where you have certain fintechs or non-banks that maybe are pushing the envelope in terms of personalization or different products that they're offering, or bank-like solutions in
Mhm.
many cases that they're developing and offering. Many times though, there is still a bank in that overall solution flow. And so that's a variation on the role a bank has played
Mhm.
historically in terms of the bank being front and center with the end customer. But I think it's important to remember the bank still plays an important infrastructure role in that case. But I think also fintech and non-banks efforts and innovations that in some ways allows for banks to see what takes,
Mhm.
right? We tell banks oftentimes what's coming next. We'll even look outside the banking industry. What does that show us about customer expectations and how I order from Starbucks now, not by going into a Starbucks, but by doing it on my phone and fully expecting my order to be ready on the counter with my name on it when I just like swing by and pick it up. That's all I do there. What is that experience suggest maybe about how financial services gets delivered in a bank eventually? And so I think there's a lot of room for banks to observe and see what works, see what doesn't work, because certainly all fintech and non-bank activity isn't successful. There are some failures there too that we can learn just as much from, and banks have an opportunity to take the best, leave the rest, and move forward, I think.
It's such great perspective. And it's funny because in my head, I always wondered what role should the ABA be playing in helping encourage and inspire there? And I think you just answered it, which is encourage that curiosity, encourage that creativity, observe things maybe outside of the standard definition of banking, because to me, it increasingly is just moving more horizontal to, I want banking to be there when and how I want it as a customer, not necessarily on historically the bank's terms, but really more on my as the customer's terms. And I'll trust you more if you show up when and where I need you.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. That is the name of the game, is really following, in many cases, the customer. One question we got recently from a bank, which was really insightful, I think, though, is, hey, look, in my community, my customers aren't pushing me, though. And so then what? At what point do I, the bank, need to say, all right, nobody's asking me for this, but gosh, it seems like everybody else is doing it, or maybe it is the right idea. And that's probably a challenge that many community banks especially deal with, where they have to, in some ways, prod their customers to explore more digital options potentially.
For sure. And it's that classic, if I had asked my customers what they wanted, they would have asked for a faster horse. And you go, that's not always the right answer, right? You need to observe all the things that are happening there. And people may not define banking in the exact same terms as a bank might. And so me making a payment outside of the bank, I may not think anything about it, and all of a sudden the bank's not playing a role there.
Right.
And I think that just where I wanted to go here. If you talk to people that think about the traditional definition of banks, it was deposits and loans, and you mentioned payments as well. But for a lot of smaller banks, at least, NIM was the business, and pay as little on deposits as I can, make as much on good loans as I can, and my margin is the difference in between. And yet you see a lot of your member banks that are increasingly diversifying their revenue, and they're finding all kinds of non-interest fee and other income streams. And that seems like the only way that banks can continue to be super successful, which probably means they have to add more value to their customers. So as you think about exploring or exciting your members about new value-added opportunities, how are you navigating that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think on one end, even with this expanded kind of horizontal set of banking products, financial service products, even you see it in there's been a lot of talk about open banking, and then the term now is supposed to shift to be open finance. I think reflecting a lot of that it's maybe not just traditional banking products that should be in scope, or that we mean to include when we're talking about that, not the regulation specifically, but just the concept more generally. But as I mentioned a little bit, I do think that banks can and will be part of the delivery mechanism for a lot of these financial products. So that's one place. But then also you see banks, I think, expanding into almost more, well, it's a vertical and a horizontal, but take like
Okay.
small business, for
Mhm.
example. Traditionally, community banks and their small businesses in their communities, very strong relationship, very personal relationship to the individual banker and to that small business owner. And are they having a deposit account? Yes. Are they offering them loans? Yes. Maybe they're their merchant services provider, so they have the payments there too. But what else can that bank offer to that small business to help them grow their business, to be that trusted partner, trusted
Mhm.
banker, trusted advisor? Do I think that community banks are so embedded in their communities that offers many natural opportunities to expand and find value added services, whether it's leveraging an AI system for personalization, maybe to offer rewards to
Mhm.
consumers. That's something that can be delivered through the bank. Payroll, kind of anything
Yeah.
related to running a business that is attached to money. Certainly, you could see the bank playing a greater role in the offering or the delivery of that type of service. But I think, yeah, I think these kind of small business, obviously not a niche segment, but there are other segments like small business that maybe are more niche, and there's kind of a bucket of solutions that banks can think about building to cater to those markets.
That's right. And it's also even just like, what do banks do well? Like, most
Right.
banks, even small ones, are really secure.
Yeah.
And I've talked to bankers who, in their local communities, have held seminars for small businesses in their community, even consumers in their community, to talk about cybersecurity and fraud
Yes.
and phishing and things that they're like, we're really well versed in this. We can share that and add value to others. And oh, by the way, maybe expand our security perimeter so that our customers are now also protected and not trying to send fraudulent wires through the bank that
Yeah.
cost everyone money.
That is a
So
perfect example.
yeah,
Yeah.
so it is I think the cool thing, I had a conversation with a bank president a year or so ago, and his point was, in all this technology transformation, he was optimistic because he said it feels like banks can be creative again and think about ideas like that or others where they can add value and
Right.
introspect. What do we do well? How do we go share that? And to your point, it could be just broader financial advice and services. It could be things that are adjacent to that,
Yeah.
which are
No.
both pretty interesting. But with that said, it feels like so many banks are on really borrowed time from an infrastructure standpoint. There's
Yes.
been a lot. What I was shocked was how many still run mainframes, how many still run their own data centers, how moving their infrastructure to the cloud in 2024 or 25 is still a big decision.
Yeah.
That at times has scared me. So as you think about that old infrastructure, I just had your friend Christian Kuntz from Zion's on recently, and we were
Excellent.
talking about their major transformation project. I'm just not sure how a bank undertakes that big of a
Mhm.
project while they're still trying to operate their business. So how do you even think about guiding them there?
Right. I love the premise of this question because downtime is not an option for a
Mhm.
bank,
That's
right?
right.
Really,
That's right.
you cannot take the system offline. And so any kind of upgrade or infrastructure replacement has to be considered in that context. So much we could talk about here. I think infrastructure upgrades, there is, to your point, a lot of work to be done here, and a lot of work that is being done across banks of all sizes. I don't think everything can be or needs to be a rip and replace. I think
Mhm.
there has to be ways to improve infrastructure on the margins and around an existing system. There's certainly going to be cases where it's going to make sense to stand up something brand new, a kind of a sidecar system, and transition over time. And that's going to work for some banks. And getting back to the earlier point that there isn't going to be a one size fits
Mhm.
all for everyone. But this question and line of thinking raises for me too is the concept of middleware. This is an area that at ABA we've spent quite a bit of time on. We have really big focus on core platforms and core processors, especially for community banks, but for all banks. That is, to reuse the word, it is core, it is critical to the operation of the banks, but effectively means that many banks outsource their technology, the whole technology stack basically, to one of these third-party processors. And so when we think about efforts to modernize and upgrade, all roads lead to and lead through the core. And as we've at ABA tried to help banks think through some of the challenges that structure poses, middleware is a potential answer there, not a silver bullet, I think. And I think that's important. Nothing is, but we wrote a white paper a couple years ago, and then actually just last year put out a product assessment evaluating a bunch of different solution providers in the middleware space. But that concept of kind of building around what you have in an effort to make what you have work better, I think is really valid and really powerful for a lot of banks in the market today.
That's right. And I think a lot of it is just the reality of what you said is like, there are not many banks that can afford to spin up an entirely new separate team outside of the day-to-day operations and say, go build our future and we'll move to that later. It's just like most people can't own two homes because they can't afford to pay for the one they have and buy a new one. And I think it's in many cases the same challenge that a lot of banks face. The other one that I'm always just perplexed, but and maybe it's a reality of just operating, is there is great indications of what customer expectations are going to look like and what the future is very likely to look like through the fintechs and early adopters that are out there. There's a lot of signal. And I sort of say all the time, banking is a totally digital business. I know a lot of banks don't yet fully live that, but it's pretty clear that most money can move in ones and zeros and not in physical weight. And so what do you feel like we can do to help people better understand both what that means and then what changes they really need to make because of that?
Yeah. I don't mean this to sound trite, but I think the answer is to ask them to talk about it, right? To get to the core of, why don't you think you need this type of change? Is it because you don't understand it? All right, let's solve that problem. Is it because you don't think your consumers want it? All right, let's dig into that a little bit and think about how your consumers interact with other of their kind of service providers in their lives. Is it a different challenge? Like they're worried that it doesn't actually work, or it introduces a new fraud problem, for example, or something else? Okay, then maybe we need to explore what variation on this technology is important. But I think at the core, it comes down to having that conversation to better understand for that bank, what is the holdup here for you? Is it cost? Is it too expensive? We can't make the business case work? Because there's a lot of, I think, valid on the surface reasons, and ultimately to make the investments that are probably necessary to get to that fully digital world, there's a lot of obstacles that are going to need to be overcome. An example, Carrie, that comes to mind is even digital account opening. This is probably one where you're smiling, I'm smiling, but it's something that many would assume is table stakes in the banking industry. Every bank can open accounts digitally. Like, not even close.
Not even close.
Not even close. And that's something that was pretty surprising to me as we've dug into that issue a little bit and thought, all right, here's an element of digital transformation that many people might assume all banks have this capability. In reality, many banks do not. And as we started talking to banks about it, yes, cost, yes, just not sure how or who to talk to go about it. But that fraud issue, really important. They just were really unsure that they could control or mitigate fraud risk with not having that in-person interaction. So that's a really important finding, I think, and just a good anecdote to say, you got to like dig into the why, because maybe throwing money at the problem isn't going to actually fix it, right? We got to understand what's really behind the hesitancy.
That's right. And for several that I've talked to, they've said our customers haven't asked for it. And again, you look at that and you go, of course they're not going to ask for it because they're going to go somewhere else and open
Yeah.
an account where they can. But the other thing that I find fascinating with that topic is if you're not opening accounts online, then you're definitely not well advised to spend money on marketing online because you won't convert it.
Sending
And
them.
so now you're locked out of a primary area where you should be competing in the marketplace to tell potential customers who you are, what you can offer, et cetera. And so as a result of not having that capability, in a lot of cases, their digital presence is not nearly as advanced as it should be. And they're not in that marketplace where they should be competing, and they should and can very favorably compete because they have the trust, they have the brand, et cetera. So it's a really interesting reality. When I think about a fully digital business, there's a lot more to it. And I think it's a big topic for both of us to continue to take up and educate them on, which is part of the fun. Part of what we get to do is help them navigate this change and challenge.
No, that's exactly right.
Well, let's go to the far front edge and let's talk about AI for a few minutes. That's not slowing down, despite what regulators or others may try to do to slow it a bit. We're seeing it increasingly, at least as a part of most of the newer technology solutions, even if it's not AI at its core. If some banker asked you today, Brooke, what's the current state of AI in banking? How do you describe that?
Yeah. So I know some people don't like the term kind of traditional AI as compared to generative AI.
Sure.
But I do think it's useful in some ways. You know, when I say to a banker that asks about the state of AI, it's like, look, your bank has probably been using
That's
some
right.
form of AI for decades. Like, so much of this is not new.
That's right.
And let's talk about the new stuff because that's important. And that's, I think, what most people mean when they're talking about artificial intelligence. And it's why we're seeing more regulatory focus on it and even legislative and congressional focus on it is because of generative AI and some of the newer capabilities. But always start with kind of reassuring, I think, that this has been around for decades.
Sure.
You've likely been using it for decades. Think of models as a primitive form of AI, and this is just automating in many ways, incorporating more data, doing more of that calculating faster, and eventually updating as you go, learning as you go. But I think the heart of the question really being more about generative AI. Here, I think it's interesting. There's certainly banks that are exploring use cases with generative AI, but I think it's still pretty early days. And maybe there'll be a tipping point here and we'll see more in production, but I haven't seen a whole lot of that yet, that there's still a sense of evaluating use cases, establishing governance models, and setting up decision-making frameworks, and making sure, to the point we talked about earlier, risk and legal and compliance and product, and everyone has a seat at this table as we explore what generative AI might mean, that it's still relatively early. But I think there's a difference between early and doing all this work in the background so that you're ready to go when the time is right, and early in that we'll start that when it's time. It's time to start, I think, doing some of that work and thinking about those use cases and developing the practice of the governance and different pieces, thinking about data and data strategy and data infrastructure and all this foundational elements that are going to need to be in place. But in terms of real live production, generative AI, Not a whole lot, I think, out there at the moment.
Yeah, I agree with you. The term we're using right now very significantly is explainable AI,
Yeah,
in that, because I think you're spot on. It's about data literacy, data intelligence. Almost, how do you explain it as a human to
yeah,
then know that a computer sitting on top of the same data is likely to get to the same or maybe a faster, better conclusion, but you can explain how they got there. If you can
right.
do that, now you're going to get the benefits, the efficiency, the speed, and in some cases, even the better conclusion.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way to look at it. I like that.
So, as you think about customers, though, what do you think customers are starting to expect from either, are they expecting AI? Are they just expecting more from their banks? And that bar, do you see that changing, or do you think it's staying pretty static?
I think it's going to change rapidly. I think it is already changing. I think customers expect personalization. They
Mhm.
expect you to know me if I'm your customer, and don't send me a offer for a credit card that I already have,
That's right.
right? Like that's annoying.
That's right.
And so I do think that yes, on that front, the banks have access in many ways to a lot of data, but we don't use it highly effectively
Mm.
in all cases to generate the insights about our customers that we could, right? And so I think that's something customers are going to come to expect, though, that they recognize you should know this about
That's right.
me. And you got to of course be wary about the so-called creepy factor. You don't want to make it weird, right, that you know all of this, but that there's going to be more of an expectation of personalization, more of an expectation of always on, always available where I want you. And I do think, I know chatbots and agents are also a very hot topic. Maybe we'll see some segmentation along demographic lines that I think customers are going to pretty quickly become comfortable interacting with AI based agents. And
Mhm.
I don't know, in many ways, maybe come to that experience a little bit and feel like you can complain to a computer in a way that maybe you wouldn't feel comfortable complaining to an actual customer service agent. I don't, but we'll see. I know there's mixed feelings on that topic for sure.
Yeah, it'll be fascinating. I'm already ready to have my personal AI agent interact with the AI agent at the bank on my
Yeah.
behalf. Just
Well, and
save me
that's,
the time.
yes, that agent to agent communication and kind of interaction, that'll be big. And I know there's certainly banks working on that, but as we said, 4,700 banks, certainly not the majority, I think, are at that phase with AI yet. And it's probably coming.
Yes. A big part of the thing holding people back, I think, is that data infrastructure, and even call it data literacy or digital literacy. When you're meeting banks, do you go through any kind of process of trying to gauge where they are on that curve of maturity and literacy? And to your point earlier, recommend things based on some of that early indicators?
Yeah, so this has been a fun project that actually a colleague of mine has really taken on and designed what we were calling at one point kind of the innovation radar. And so
Mm.
we just put a whole bunch of these different existing and emerging bank innovations and technologies on a map, segmented by time horizon and a couple different dimensions. But the general idea was, for the near term things, it's not that you, the bank, need to have implemented every single one of these things,
Sure.
but you should have been deliberate about thinking through whether it makes sense for you. Is it the right strategy? And the answer can very well be no, and then great, move on. But to have thought through
Mm.
and developed the business case for, is this right? And made that deliberate decision. And then you move out, and then these are maybe things a little further afield where you should be exploring, talking to vendors, going through that process of evaluation. And then at the further end, where it really is about okay, do I understand this buzzword? Do I know how important it is? And we could take a bank through that innovation radar in a conversation and pretty quickly get a handle of, all right, you're in the right spots. You're
Sure.
exploring what you should be exploring. You're aware of what these terms are or not. And
Mhm.
then just generally asking who's your core, which is, as we said, a really critical part of what that tech stack is going to look like, what's on the roadmap. I think you can pretty quickly start to see where where that digital literacy fits and lands.
And along those lines, how do you find in 2024, 25, most banks are determining what they should be doing, who they should be doing it with? Like how are they finding their best partners and technology solutions in your mind?
Yeah, so I think a couple things. One, I hope they're leveraging their trade association
Sure.
and their other consulting partners, venture partners. There's so many resources out there to help them. But at the end of the day, I think word of mouth and a
Mm.
recommendation from a peer institution goes the furthest. But then also, very tactically, it's the core provider integrations, right? It's who already is connected that might make sense for that next integration, just because it does have the feature of shrinking implementation timelines potentially, and that can be a good source as well.
Do you think that is the right answer moving forward? Do they have the right that sounds more like this is what we have
What we
done.
have.
And I think where I get concerned, part of what we talked about early on was, do you need new inputs into that decision matrix, into that decision process, maybe even on your team? It feels like to me in many cases, banks are trying to hire from within banking as opposed to how do you go hire the best and brightest in business
Yeah.
in various areas to come in. I mean, you're an outsider into the banking industry. I'm largely an outsider into the industry. Do you feel like they're embracing the how do we attract new and better talent into banking?
Mhm. I think they're trying to. I think you, Carrie, when we've talked before, you've talked about how do making banking cool again, which
Mhm.
I love. And actually, that exact phrase had come up at a community bankers council meeting we had at the ABA. And how can we make banking cool again? And I think the ability to hire is it's can be so hard, right? And it is about, it's not just the finance professionals. We need the
Sure.
tech professionals and the developers and the people professionals and relationship managers. And a couple of tactical things. Can we, as an industry, offer more internships? Can
Mhm.
we getting involved in communities and school systems to demonstrate that breadth of opportunity? I think a lot of people don't know all of the jobs
That's
that
right.
probably are encompassed in a bank, both at the branch level and at kind of the corporate level. So there's a lot there. And I think just exposing that opportunity and that information to more people is going to help. But your other point, is that the right answer about leveraging recommendations from your core provider? It's important, no, that's probably not the best way. But I do respect the challenge there, that there
Mhm.
are so many fintechs. The answer also isn't just to wait for the pings on LinkedIn, right?
That's
You'll go crazy in your inbox, in your LinkedIn messaging platform, trying to weed through all of that. That is, I think, a real unsolved challenge, quite frankly, in the market today, is how do we weed through all of these solutions? And I think it's why that word of mouth has become so important.
That's right. I don't think I told you this. We just kicked off our very first bank tech fellowship, and we have a little over 2 dozen people that have joined us. And our goal is to really expose them to this broader industry
Love
and
that.
get them excited to maybe go work in banking or go work in a bank and understand that this is a really dynamic industry that pervades everything. I mean,
Yes.
it is a part of everything. And whether it's happening within the four walls of a bank or not, it's all interconnected in really important ways. So we're hopeful that we can get this group really excited to if they're not in the industry, jump in and become a part of it as really high potential talent.
That's awesome. I really love that y'all are doing that. It's
So we'll
great.
report back. We'll see how it goes. But the other side, we talked a little bit earlier about fintechs and non-banks, and you think about non-bank credit as an example that has just exploded. And in many cases, there are banks on the back end that are lending to these funds in other ways, but they've tended to be much less regulated and yet have moved faster and are becoming, in many cases, directly competitive with banks. How do you think about that? Because it is part of strategy and innovation, but it's also this, where is the regulatory and legal environment around this going to go?
Yeah, we think about it a lot. It's the bread and butter for ABA is policy advocacy too. And so we care deeply and advocate strongly for a regulatory framework that promotes and supports responsible innovation. And sitting in the banking side of the industry, there's an offensive and a defensive element to that, right? We want a rule set that enables banks to compete effectively and to try new things in a safe and sound manner and responsibly. But we also want to ensure that there's a level playing field, and that at the core of that is about consumers not being confused, right? Being afforded the same type of protection or knowing what they're getting when they're going to a bank and when they're going to a non-bank, and understanding what the differences are, what makes a bank and what type of protections that gives them that they might not have at a non-bank. So yeah, I wish I had a crystal ball to know where it's all going to end up. But I think financial policy, it has evolved over the years. It will continue to. And I think at its core, though, banks, of course, have a role to play, will continue to play that very important role as a trusted partner to their customers.
Yeah, I agree. The clarity in the market is probably part of the current problem, in that people, in many cases, assume or think they're getting something because it's allowed for them to assume that they may or may not be actually getting. We've seen some blowups, and some of those things may help correct that as well. The time we have left, let's talk a little bit more about you, Brooke. I'm first curious, what led you to the ABA? What drew you there?
Yeah. So when you mentioned I did a little bit of, or quite a bit of strategy consulting work after I got my MBA. And that was actually with a boutique firm focused just on the payments industry. So that was kind of my experience in financial services, not necessarily banking specific, but payment specific. And so after doing a couple other things, getting back to financial services was definitely a draw to me, and leveraging that subject matter experience that I've had. And then 3.5 years into the ABA, I've just really discovered I love being in an association. It's actually, it's so fun to get to represent an industry in many ways and talk to our members and learn how they're the same and different and what all the different challenges they face. And then get to be in a spot where both on the policy side and the member services side, how can we help? What can we do about it? And it's a lot of fun.
That's awesome. When you first got there, what most surprised you? It was your first association, and sometimes you have people that move across even different associations, different industries. So what most surprised you versus other environments?
Yeah, I think how diverse the banking system is in the United States. While I knew payments, I thought pretty well. It's just 4,700 banks. I've said that already 3 times, I think, this podcast. Most people could name 20 banks, 30 banks, 40 banks. It's just such a small fraction of the number of banks that are actually out there. And they are so different. That is something I did not fully appreciate until it was here and in it. And it's really one of the features of the US banking system, and offers such benefits, I think, to have all different stripes. But yeah, that was probably the most surprising.
As you look into your first few years there, what are you most proud of that you've accomplished so far?
Well, it's all, of course, a team effort, but we've done some great things. I think I had the opportunity to join at a time where we were really diving into innovation in banking, and our predecessor had kind of set the groundwork for the Office of Innovation. And then it got to be my job to say, all right, what does that mean? What are we actually going to do with it? And so we started an innovation forum, which now we've hosted twice, an innovation event attached to our annual convention for bankers. We've done more on the venture investment side and partnering with different fintech accelerators to think about how can we kind of get to know the fintech market better to help make some of those connections with banks when it makes sense. So there's been a lot of blank space to try new things, and feel really lucky that the leadership at ABA has allowed us to say yes and to try new things. And I don't know, it's been fun.
That's awesome. What do you consider your core values? Just is how you show up in the world.
Yeah, good question. I think at the top, I'd say integrity. I think there's just so much to be said for being honest, just with myself and of course with others. Mean what you say, what you mean. It goes a long way, and it helps get through problems, help prevent problems from even starting. So that's certainly one. And then another one would be just something around the work, like digging in, learning, ask the questions. I guess there's an element of being vulnerable, and it's really hard, right? Because you don't want to not know something that maybe you feel like you should know. But what I've discovered here too is banking is also really complicated. It's not simple. And there are very few people that could explain the difference between the ACH system and to the Fedwire system and all these, and you just have to ask. And that's okay, because you learn from that. And that's what allows you to get smarter, to share that knowledge with other people. But if you don't dig in and learn it, then I don't know, you just stay on the surface level.
Yeah, your core values come out so clearly in just how you present yourself, and it's so refreshing. That's part of what I so enjoy and appreciate about you. One thing I like to ask my guests, because I have the great fortune of meeting super successful people like you, what habits or rituals have you really embraced to help you? Because I find that those are often great things to give back to other people too.
Yeah, I love the question. So I would say I have all the lists. I'm a list person, and I do try really hard to keep them in the same place, right? Gone through periods where I've been a paper person, where I've been just a digital person, but lists are important. I think for me, if I don't write it down, it doesn't get done. And I also do enjoy the crossing off of the things when they are done. But then also, and this maybe is just a little abstract, but just continually refining kind of my operating model, what works for me, because it's not the same today as it was 10 years ago. And it's life changes, people change, jobs change, your family situation changes. And to expect that what worked when you were just out of college will work today is completely unrealistic. And so I think that's, not being dogmatic about this is the answer. That's worked for me.
That's awesome. Well, last question, Brooke, and I'm always bummed when I get to the end because I'd love to continue this for now, but we'll do another one. What advice do you have? You're such a giver, and I know as a mother as well, but what advice do you have for early professionals that are saying, I want to end up where you did? What advice do you have for them to just get on their path of success?
Yeah. Well, first, thank you. This has been so much fun, and appreciate everything you've said. The one, I do think that the kind of second value, dig in, learn, ask questions, do all of that, and do it from the beginning. And especially in the beginning when truly nobody thinks twice about you asking a question. The expectations just aren't there for you to be an expert yet, and take advantage of that time. But then you also, Carrie, you referenced my career, has done a couple twists and turns and worked in several different settings. And so for me, don't make a change when it's not right. Don't be afraid to make a change. And maybe you'll wind up back in the same place where you started. And that's okay, because those places you went in the interim were all, offering a new set of skills or experience. And that's part of what you're bringing back. I don't know. I've always had a fear of getting stuck somewhere. And that's driven, in some cases, some of the changes I've made in my career. But I'm really grateful for it, because it's I don't know, it's all has worked out. And in the end, I'm nowhere near the end, I hope. But if you're too afraid to take that leap, you might get stuck. And I think that's something to be real cautious about.
Great advice. Thank you, Brooke. I'm so appreciative. I knew this would be a fun conversation, as ours always are.
Yeah.
And thanks for everything you're doing for the banking industry. It does truly take a village, as you referenced earlier. And I'm just excited that we get to do more together in the years to come.
Yeah. Well, this has been a lot of fun, Carrie. Thanks. Thanks again.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Operate Podcast. If you like this conversation, as a favor to me, you can rate us, review us, or subscribe, or tell your friends. You can also reach out to us on Twitter at Operate Podcast. Until next week, get out there and operate.